Texas, August 1943. The morning sun climbs over endless fields of cotton and mesquite, turning the horizon into gold. Cicadas hum in the heat. A U.S. Army truck rolls down a dirt road toward a fenced compound. Neat rows of barracks surrounded not by barbed menace, but by open land stretching to the horizon. Inside the truck, dozens of German officers sit in silence. Their uniforms, though dusted from the Atlantic crossing, still carry the insignia of a defeated pride. Africa Corps patches, iron crosses, and the faint salt of a lost empire. Their faces are hard, prepared for humiliation, interrogation. Perhaps worse, when the truck stops, the gates open. But instead of armed hostility, they are met with calm American MPs, clean water, and even a polite "welcome, gentlemen." The prisoners look around in disbelief. No shouting, no beatings, just open sky, Texas heat, and the distant sound of tractors. They had expected chains. Instead, they were handed shovels. And freedom. The war had brought them across an ocean, but what awaited them in Texas would challenge everything they thought they knew about their enemy. By 1943, the world was burning. The Wehrmacht, once the unstoppable spear of Hitler's ambitions, was losing ground on every front. In North Africa, Rommel's Africa Corps, the Desert Fox's proud army, had been encircled by British and American forces. At Tunisia, the last German formations laid down their arms in May 1943. Nearly $250,000 Axis soldiers, Germans and Italians alike, were captured. The Allies faced an unexpected problem: what to do with so many prisoners. Britain's camps were already overflowing, and the war in Europe was far from over. Transporting the captured men back across the Atlantic seemed risky, but the United States had both the space and the resources to handle them. American planners saw a strategic advantage: move prisoners far from any active front where escape was nearly impossible, and use them to relieve the labor shortage created by millions of Americans now in uniform. So the decision was made, quietly, efficiently. Beginning in the summer of 1942, the first German prisoners were shipped across the Atlantic in Liberty ships returning from delivering war supplies to Europe. They were unloaded not in chains, but under the watchful eyes of military police, clean, fed, and processed under the terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention. That document, signed years before the war, demanded humane treatment for all prisoners, adequate food, shelter, medical care, and even pay for work done. The United States would adhere to it scrupulously, not only for moral reasons but for calculation. If the U.S. treated German prisoners well, perhaps the same would be done for captured Americans in Europe. By late 1943, more than 400,000 Axis POWs were held on American soil. They were scattered across over 500 camps, stretching from the pine forests of Maine to the deserts of Arizona. But no state would host more prisoners than Texas. The Lone Star State was ideal. Vast, rural, and insulated from the coasts, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built dozens of camps across its flat plains. Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, Camp Mexia, Camp Huntsville, and more. Each was built with military precision. Neat barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, and recreation yards, all guarded by towers and perimeter fences. To the local Texans, it was both curiosity and opportunity. The war had drained farms of young men. Crops were rotting in the fields. Now, the arrival of these uniformed Europeans offered a strange kind of salvation: enemy hands to pick American cotton. For the German prisoners, it was a journey into the unknown. They had left behind the chaos of North Africa and the ruins of Hitler's promise. Now they crossed a peaceful American countryside where towns bore names they'd never heard: Brenham, Hearn, Bastrop. The contrast was surreal. One day they were soldiers in Hitler's army. The next, they were field hands in Texas under the same sun that scorched Allied wheat. The U.S. military's handling of them was meticulous. The Provost Marshal General's office, under Major General Archer Lurch, oversaw every aspect, from camp discipline to educational programs. Officers were separated from enlisted men. Propaganda material was confiscated. And yet, within those wire fences, the prisoners found something none expected in war: respect. American guards were told to treat them as soldiers, not criminals. There were no beatings, no starvation, no humiliation. Many German officers, steeped in Nazi propaganda about barbaric Americans, were stunned by the discipline and fairness they encountered. They had expected vengeance. Instead, they found order. And soon word began to spread among the POWs. Texas was not a prison. It was something far stranger, a land where their enemy fed them well, paid them for labor, and even allowed them to sing their own songs. It was here, amid the cotton fields and red dust, that German officers would confront not just defeat, but dissonance, between everything they had been taught about the enemy and what they were now witnessing firsthand. The first trainloads arrived quietly at night, rolling through the Texas plains under starlight. When the doors opened, the heat hit them like a wall. They blinked into a foreign dawn and realized this would be their world for years to come. When the first German officers arrived in Texas in the summer of 1943, they expected a prison. What they found instead looked more like a small town. Camp Hearn, one of the largest and most studied POW sites in the United States, stood on 720 acres of flat, open land near Hearn, Texas, about halfway between Houston and Waco. It was encircled by double rows of barbed wire, but inside it had paved streets, tidy wooden barracks, kitchens, a hospital, a chapel, a library, and even a theater. The American commandant, Lieutenant Colonel William Holden, was strict but fair. His orders were clear. These were soldiers, not criminals. They were to be treated according to the Geneva Convention, a directive that would later earn Camp Hearn the nickname the Model Camp. Each prisoner was issued a mattress, soap, clean clothes, and even access to a commissary where they could buy small comforts with tokens earned from labor. Food rations were identical to those given to U.S. troops. For many Germans, and especially those captured in North Africa, the meals were almost luxurious. Still, suspicion lingered. Many Texans feared escape attempts or sabotage. Newspapers called the camps enemy colonies. Some farmers grumbled that the prisoners ate better than civilians living under rationing, but the government's approach was pragmatic. The War Manpower Commission had declared a critical labor shortage. With millions of American men overseas, agriculture was collapsing under the strain. The POW labor program became a solution born of necessity. Under military supervision, German prisoners were leased out to local farmers and businesses, picking cotton, harvesting rice, cutting timber, or maintaining railroads. They worked hard, but not as slaves. Each received 80 cents a day in canteen credits as the Geneva Convention required. To the shock of many, local Texans quickly realized these enemies were not monsters. They were polite, skilled, and disciplined workers. In the fields, the first fragile bonds began to form. Farmers offered water in the heat. Poles helped repair equipment. Children stared curiously from fences as uniformed Germans sweated under the same sun as their fathers overseas. Slowly, hostility turned into a quiet coexistence. Back inside the camps, the German officers organized themselves with characteristic order. Barracks were divided by rank and unit. Former teachers opened schools. Engineers designed makeshift machinery. Musicians formed orchestras. Within months, Camp Hearn had a functioning theater troupe, a newspaper, Der Zaungast and the Fence Guest, and classes in everything from English to mathematics. It was an odd paradox. Behind barbed wire, life was thriving. For the U.S. military, this was part of a broader strategy. The Office of War Information understood the power of image. Newsreels and Red Cross inspections were encouraged. German POWs were photographed reading books, working the fields, even playing soccer, all proof that America treated its prisoners humanely. It was psychological warfare of a quiet, moral kind, contrasting sharply with reports from Nazi camps in Europe. But there was another layer beneath the surface. Among the prisoners themselves, tensions brewed. Fanatical Nazis, especially those loyal to the SS, sought to maintain ideological control. They organized secret courts, punished traitors, and enforced discipline through fear. Many officers were torn between old loyalties to the Reich and the growing realization that their enemy's humanity was eroding their own convictions. For now, though, the war seemed distant. The Texas sun beat down, the crops ripened, and the prisoners found rhythm in routine. Roll call, work, meals, and letters from home. The guards, mostly older men or soldiers unfit for combat, treated their charges with quiet professionalism. And so, by the autumn of 1943, a strange peace settled over the Texas countryside. The barbed wire shimmered in the heat, but inside the men began to rediscover something lost amid years of propaganda and battle, the ordinariness of human life. They still wore the enemy's uniform, but in the quiet of the fields, under a sky without bombs, the line between victor and vanquished began to blur. The stage was set for a transformation, one that would unfold not through gunfire, but through dignity, discipline, and an unexpected kindness that neither side had foreseen. For most of the German officers, the first shock of capture had passed by the time they reached Texas. The second shock was how normal life soon became. They awoke to bugle calls and flag ceremonies. Breakfast smelled of coffee, eggs, and toast. In the mess hall, wooden tables echoed with the scrape of tin trays, not chains. Work details left the camps each morning under armed escort, heading into the surrounding countryside. Some went to cotton fields, others to sawmills or road maintenance crews. Texas farmers, at first suspicious, quickly realized that the Germans were diligent and precise. They pruned trees neatly, stacked hay methodically, and sometimes even corrected the farmers' machinery. Local papers began to run stories. Enemy soldiers help harvest Texas cotton. German prisoners earn praise from farmers. For the prisoners, it was disorienting. They had been trained to see Americans as decadent, chaotic, inferior, yet here they found a nation that worked efficiently, fed its prisoners well, and allowed them to send mail home. Every letter was censored, of course, but many POWs wrote the same thing again and again. We are treated fairly. The Americans follow the rules. Some prisoners even described it as too humane. Officers felt their authority dissolve as enlisted men mingled with guards, laughed, and exchanged cigarettes. To some, this was humiliation. To others, liberation. The Americans were deliberate about this. They knew morale mattered. The camps were designed to break the cycle of blind obedience not through force, but through exposure to freedom. As months passed, the camps became small societies. Men formed orchestras, theater troupes, and soccer leagues. Camp Hearn even hosted a full-length performance of Faust, complete with painted backdrops and costumes sewn from burlap and dyed sheets. It was an act of resistance, not against the Americans, but against despair. In the camp newspaper Der Zaungast, prisoners debated philosophy, printed poetry, and even criticized Hitler's war, though carefully for fear of informants. For the first time, many confronted the possibility that their enemy might be more civilized than the Reich itself. To some officers, that thought was unbearable. To others, it was awakening. Behind this apparent generosity lay cold calculation. The U.S. government understood that kindness could be as powerful as any weapon. From Washington to the War Department, officials recognized that humane treatment of POWs was not only lawful, it was strategic. First, there was the reciprocity factor. By following the Geneva Convention meticulously, the U.S. hoped Germany would do the same for captured American pilots and soldiers. The Red Cross regularly inspected camps, and every report that spoke of American decency became ammunition in diplomatic channels. But there was also a subtler motive: psychological warfare. Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as a nation of mongrels, ruled by chaos and greed. By treating German officers with respect and exposing them to American order, culture, and abundance, the U.S. undermined that myth. Every well-fed prisoner, every letter home describing fairness became a seed of doubt in the minds of German families still loyal to Hitler. Inside Camp Hearn, this effect was measurable. The U.S. Army's Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, led by Brigadier General Frederick H. Osborne, introduced a program to quietly re-educate prisoners, not through lectures, but through exposure. They distributed translated copies of Life magazine, American novels, and newspapers. They allowed lectures on democracy, freedom, and post-war reconstruction. They encouraged sportsmanship and fair play, values they believed represented the American character. It was subtle, methodical, and effective. Many of the younger POWs, drafted late into Hitler's war, began to absorb these lessons. They contrasted the fairness of their captors with the brutality of the Nazi officers among them. They began to question the Reich's morality, and while no one spoke of conversion, the change was visible. One American observer wrote, "The best propaganda against Nazism was simply letting the prisoners live among free men." The impact rippled outward. In later years, many former POWs would say that their first true understanding of democracy came not from books, but from watching how the Americans treated them when they were powerless. Still, the U.S. strategy was not without flaws. Some guards resented the comfort given to the enemy. Others feared escape or sabotage, and deep within the barracks, Nazi loyalists plotted in whispers, determined to preserve the Führer's spirit, even behind the wire. But for now, the balance held. The camps functioned with clockwork precision, their order maintained not by cruelty, but by discipline and mutual respect. Each sunrise over the Texas field seemed to carry a quiet message, one that would outlast the war itself. Strength need not come from domination. Sometimes it came from restraint, and soon, that restraint would be tested to its limit. Within months of arrival, Camp Hearn and its sister installations in Texas became unlikely centers of German culture, cities of intellect and art, fenced in by war. The prisoners were not a random collection of men. Many were educated professionals, engineers, teachers, artists, and musicians drawn from every corner of Hitler's army. Deprived of their military purpose, they rebuilt what they had lost: order, meaning, and community. They organized concerts with handmade instruments. They carved chess pieces from soap and bone. They staged plays with improvised costumes and hand-painted scenery. At Camp Herne, an orchestra of 40 men performed Mozart, Beethoven, and Strauss for audiences of fellow prisoners, and sometimes even American guards. The sound of violins drifting over the Texas plains was surreal, the music of Europe reborn behind barbed wire. For the U.S. Army, this flourishing culture was not a problem. It was encouraged. Commanders believed that mental engagement reduced escape attempts and maintained discipline. A bored soldier could become a danger. A busy one was manageable, so the guards watched as their prisoners transformed empty barracks into classrooms. Courses were organized in mathematics, architecture, English, and political science. Some men earned academic credit later recognized in post-war Germany. Others taught literacy to comrades who had never learned to read. There were even POW newspapers. Der Zaungast printed essays, humor columns, and sketches of camp life, always reviewed by censors but never silenced completely. In one editorial, a prisoner wrote, "We are strangers in a strange land, yet we are treated as men. Perhaps the Americans wish to conquer us not by arms but by example." It was a quiet revolution of thought. The camp had become a microcosm of Germany itself, one still divided between the old order and the new, but beneath this surface of civility, a darker struggle unfolded. Among the prisoners were loyal Nazis, men of the SS, stormtroopers, and officers steeped in ideology. They saw the camp's leniency as weakness, its tolerance as moral decay. For them, the war was not over, even in defeat. These men formed secret committees known as Kameradschaftsabende, comradeship circles. They spied on fellow prisoners, reported dissenters, and enforced Nazi discipline through intimidation. Inside Camp Herne, propaganda leaflets circulated under the barrack doors. Portraits of Hitler were drawn in secret. The phrase "one people, one Führer" whispered through the night. The Americans, following the Geneva Convention, allowed prisoners to self-govern in internal matters. That policy gave Nazi loyalists control of camp leadership. At least initially, they imposed rigid order, salutes, roll calls, and punishment for disobedience. Prisoners who questioned Hitler or expressed sympathy toward the Allies were labeled traitors. Some were beaten, some were ostracized, and in extreme cases they were executed, hanged in the latrines or found dead after mysterious accidents. The U.S. command began to notice. Reports of intimidation filtered through. Letters intercepted by censors revealed the growing fear among moderate prisoners. "We live among wolves," one wrote. "The guards protect us, but they cannot save us from our own." In 1944, the War Department established segregation camps to separate hardline Nazis from moderates and apolitical soldiers. The goal was to break the ideological chain, to isolate fanaticism before it poisoned the rest. Texas became one of the first testing grounds for this experiment. Camp Herne received its share of loyalists and doubters alike. The result was a fragile coexistence, a society in miniature, where one half still served Hitler and the other began to see a different world. This moral divide ran deeper than politics. It was a question of conscience. For many prisoners, the realization came slowly. The war they fought was not just lost on the battlefield, but in the soul. The Americans had done something no weapon could. They had removed hate from context. They had shown that decency could exist even between enemies. And in that revelation, the structure of Nazi belief began to crack. The most profound battles in the Texas camps were not fought with guns but with ideas. Each day, German officers confronted a simple contradiction. They had been told America was a land of chaos, moral decay, and racial weakness. Yet here they saw order, law, and fairness. They saw white and black soldiers working side by side. Imperfectly, yes, but with dignity. They saw guards who obeyed rules even when they didn't have to. To some it was bewildering. To others, infuriating. A captured officer named Hans-Jürgen Hagemann later wrote, "We arrived expecting vengeance, and instead we were met with civilization." It was impossible to reconcile. This slow erosion of belief was exactly what American strategists intended. The War Department's Psychological Warfare Division studied reports from Texas camps to understand how humane treatment could fracture ideological control. Every act of fairness, every meal served without insult, every opportunity to learn became a counter-argument to Nazism. By 1944, the transformation was visible. Prisoners began painting American landscapes instead of battle scenes. Choirs performed Christian hymns in English. Educational programs discussing post-war democracy were met, not with laughter, but with cautious interest. For many German officers, this experience planted the first seeds of a new identity, one that would grow long after their release. Years later, when they returned to a devastated Germany, they would recall that strange, sun-drenched chapter of captivity as a turning point. They had lost a war, but found a truth. And yet, not all accepted it. Among the barbed wire and wheat fields, the old ideology fought desperately to survive. That struggle would soon explode into violence, marking the true turning point of the Texas camps. By 1944, the Texas camps had become small worlds of their own, disciplined, efficient, and, to the casual observer, peaceful. But beneath that order, a dangerous undercurrent ran through the barracks. The war in Europe was nearing its peak. Hitler's armies were retreating from Russia. Allied bombers filled German skies, and rumors of defeat crept across the Atlantic. Inside Camp Herne, the prisoners followed every development through Red Cross bulletins and smuggled German newspapers. As the Third Reich began to falter, fanaticism inside the camps only intensified. For the die-hard Nazis, defeat was unthinkable. To admit it would mean acknowledging that everything they had fought for, every oath, every comrade, had been for nothing. The only way to preserve meaning was to double down on ideology, even in captivity. They began to police the thoughts of their fellow prisoners. Meetings were held at night, behind barrack doors with blankets hung over windows. Whispered speeches invoked Hitler's name, calling for discipline and loyalty. Prisoners suspected of sympathy toward the Allies were branded Verräter, traitors. Some were beaten, some simply vanished. The Americans, bound by the Geneva Convention, allowed self-governance within the camps. They knew tensions existed, but few understood how violent it could become until it was too late. The first major incident occurred at Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, in November 1943, when a German prisoner, Private Johannes Kunze, was accused of collaborating with the Americans. He was beaten to death by his fellow POWs. His body was dumped near the latrines. The shock of that murder echoed through the entire POW system. It revealed the power of Nazi loyalists to enforce control, even in defeat, even in foreign captivity. And in Texas, the same forces were building toward tragedy. At Camp Herne, several prisoners had begun to voice doubts about Hitler's leadership. They had seen too much. The reports from Europe, the clear superiority of American industry, the treatment they themselves received. They had begun to speak cautiously about a Germany after Hitler. For the Loyalists, this was treason. In early 1944, a former Luftwaffe pilot named Ernst Berner was overheard praising American efficiency and criticizing the Nazi regime. Within days, he was denounced by fellow officers. A secret tribunal of fanatics convened, not sanctioned by the Americans but operating in defiance of them. Late one night, Berner was dragged from his bunk, beaten, and strangled with a towel. The camp guards found his body at dawn. The official report called it suicide. Few believed it. The Americans began to understand that the enemy within the wire was not external. It was ideological. The Provost Marshal General's office issued new directives. Known Nazis were to be separated from moderates. Informants were to be protected. Camps across the South reorganized their populations. Camp Herne became a focal point for Loyalists, while Camp Mexia, further east, began housing prisoners deemed re-educatable. But the separation came too late to stop the next act of violence. In July 1944, news of the failed assassination attempt against Hitler, the July 20th plot, reached the camps. For some prisoners, it was confirmation that even within Germany, resistance existed. For others, it was the ultimate betrayal. When a POW at Camp Swift voiced his approval of the plot, a group of SS loyalists attacked him. He survived barely. The Americans responded with searches, interrogations, and isolation wards. Guards began carrying sidearms at all times. Yet even as these incidents unfolded, the U.S. commanders refused to abandon their principles. The prisoners would still be treated humanely. There would be no collective punishment, no retaliation. And that, in its own way, enraged the extremists further. To them, the Americans' restraint was proof of moral weakness, the same decadence their propaganda had always claimed. But to the moderates, it was proof of something profound, strength through justice. Each act of kindness from their captors became a mirror, held up to the cruelty within their own ranks. The Americans' patience, their fairness, their discipline, it cut deeper than any weapon could. Still, the violence continued in whispers and shadows. Files filled with reports of intimidation, coded letters, and secret Nazi councils. By late 1944, the camps were no longer merely places of confinement. They were ideological battlegrounds, where the Third Reich's dying flame flickered desperately against the encroaching light of defeat. The climax would come soon, not in battle, but in moral confrontation. Because in Texas, the war for hearts and minds was reaching its final, silent reckoning. By late 1944, the Texas sun had grown cruel again. The war in Europe was nearing its end. though few inside the camps knew it for certain. Across the ocean, Allied forces had landed in Normandy. Paris had been liberated. The Reich was shrinking by the week. In the Texas camps, that reality hit like a storm. The more the German front collapsed, the more violent the true believers became. The camp fences no longer merely divided prisoners from guards. They divided Germans from Germans. Camp Herne, once the model camp, was now fractured. Moderates and anti-Nazis whispered among themselves, while diehards strutted the compound in crisp uniforms, saluting portraits of a Führer they would never see again. The Americans increased patrols. Spotlights scanned the perimeter each night. Still the violence simmered. Then came the murder that would expose the full scale of the ideological war inside the wire. In early 1945, a prisoner named Hugo Kraus, a 32-year-old sergeant and known anti-Nazi, was found dead behind one of the barracks. He had been strangled with electrical wire. A note pinned to his tunic read, "Für Vaterland und Ehre," for fatherland and honor. The message was unmistakable. This was not a crime of passion. It was execution by ideology. The camp guards were shaken. For months, rumors had circulated about secret Nazi tribunals, Lagergerichte, self-appointed courts of the fanatical faction. Now their existence could no longer be denied. American investigators began interrogating the prisoners, but loyalty ran deep. Witnesses were silent. Memories failed. The culture of discipline and fear, drilled into them through years of Nazi indoctrination, held firm, even in defeat. The commandant, Lieutenant Colonel William Holden, ordered an immediate lockdown. Canteens were closed. All assemblies were banned. Work details were suspended. For the first time since its creation, Camp Herne felt like a prison. And yet, even amid the chaos, the American response was measured. No beatings, no reprisals. The investigation was meticulous, conducted according to U.S. military law. It was a defining moment. America's moral restraint under the shadow of barbarism. The murder of Kraus could not be ignored. The War Department sent investigators from the Provost Marshal's office. Eventually, through coded letters and whispered confessions, 5 prisoners were identified as ringleaders. They were charged with conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder. The trial, held under U.S. military jurisdiction, began in 1945. It was unprecedented. German officers, still prisoners of war, now stood accused not by their enemies, but by their own. The proceedings drew quiet attention from across the camp system. Guards, Red Cross representatives, and journalists watched as each defendant, dressed in immaculate field gray, faced the weight of justice, not for wartime acts, but for crimes committed in the supposed peace of captivity. The defense argued that Kraus had been a traitor, a spy for the Americans. The prosecution countered that no belief, no ideology could justify murder. In the end, the verdict was swift. All 5 were found guilty. In July 1945, 2 months after Germany's unconditional surrender, they were executed by hanging at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The case sent shockwaves through the POW network. For the first time, Nazi fanaticism had been confronted not by propaganda, but by justice, calm, methodical, and final. After the trial, something changed in the Texas camps. The fanatics retreated into silence. The swastikas painted in secret were scraped away. The old slogans stopped echoing at roll call. In their place came quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a moral collapse. The moderate prisoners, now unafraid, began to speak openly. They discussed rebuilding Germany after the war, the future of democracy, and what it meant to be honorable men in defeat. One American guard later recalled, "It was as if a fever had broken. They stopped looking backward. They started looking homeward." And so, as the final months of war unfolded across Europe, a strange peace returned to the Texas fields. The guards stood at their posts. The prisoners worked, read, played soccer. The news of Hitler's death reached them in May 1945, broadcast over loudspeakers. Many stood in silence. Some wept, others turned away. But for most, the feeling was not grief, it was disbelief. The Führer was gone, the Reich had fallen, and here they were, alive, in a land that had treated them better than their own regime ever had. The American officers who oversaw the camps were often asked later why they had shown such restraint. Even in the face of Nazi violence, their answer was always the same: because we had to be better. The United States had fought this war not only with bombs and bullets, but with ideals. If they had abandoned those ideals, even toward their enemies, they would have lost something greater than victory. The Germans who lived through it never forgot. Years later, when historians interviewed former POWs, many spoke of Texas not as imprisonment, but as revelation. One recalled, It was there in that camp that I first learned what freedom meant, and it came from my captors. In that paradox of freedom found through captivity, the war's moral balance quietly shifted. The fields of Texas, where German officers once expected chains, had become the unlikely frontier of conscience in a world gone mad. And though the war in Europe was ending, the story of these men, and what they carried home, was only beginning. The summer of 1945 arrived quietly in Texas. For the first time in years, the sound of war, distant artillery reports, radio broadcasts of bombings, casualty lists faded into silence. The war was over. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Inside the POW camps, the news came through loudspeakers and official bulletins. There were no cheers, no celebrations, only stunned silence. The men who had once marched under banners of conquest now stood in rows, heads bowed, their future uncertain. Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, Camp Huntsville, all were now filled with men who no longer had a country to serve. Their uniforms, once symbols of pride, had become relics of a destroyed order, and yet even in defeat, they remained under American care. The U.S. Army maintained its discipline to the very end. Food, medical care, and pay continued. The same guards who had watched them for years now prepared their charges for repatriation. Each man was photographed, documented, and given the basic supplies for return, clothing, rations, and identification papers. But few wanted to leave. By the time repatriation began in late 1945, life in the Texas camps had become almost ordinary. Safe, predictable, humane. For many prisoners, the thought of returning to Germany, a land of ruins, hunger, and occupation, filled them with dread. Letters trickled in from family members describing devastation, cities flattened, farms burned, civilians starving. Some learned that their homes no longer existed. Others discovered that their families had been displaced or killed in the bombings. To go home was not to return. It was to face what was left. American officials faced a logistical nightmare. Nearly 400,000 Axis prisoners were scattered across the United States, and all had to be repatriated in accordance with international law. The process would take more than 2 years. In the meantime, work continued. The field still needed hands, and many prisoners were glad to earn extra pay rather than sit idle. The farmers who had once feared them now shook their hands at the end of each day. In some towns, friendships formed. Quiet, cautious, but real. Texan families invited German prisoners to share meals on holidays. Others left gifts or letters of thanks when work details ended. It was not forgiveness. It was simple humanity. One farmer near Bryan, Texas, remembered. They worked hard, never complained. When they left, it felt like saying goodbye to neighbors. By 1946, the camps began to empty. Trains lined up again at the depots, the same kind that had brought the prisoners years before. Now, instead of armed guards and fear, there were waves and farewells. Some prisoners were sent directly to Germany. Others were temporarily transferred to British or French custody for labor and post-war reconstruction. The irony was not lost on them. Men who had fought for Hitler's empire were now rebuilding the Europe they had helped destroy. Still, many carried with them a quiet memory of America, of Texas, of sunlight on open fields and the strange decency of their captors. A former Camp Hearn prisoner, Wilhelm Schroeder, later recalled, "We came to Texas as enemies. We left as men who could no longer hate." For him and thousands of others, the barbed wire had not confined them. It had stripped away the illusion of superiority that Nazism had built. The Americans had done something few armies ever had in history. They had won not only through force of arms, but through restraint. By the end of 1946, only a handful of POW camps remained active. Camp Hearn closed its gates for the final time. The barracks were dismantled, the fences torn down. The land returned to quiet. Cows grazed where watchtowers once stood, but the story of what happened there would echo far beyond those fields, because the men who left Texas carried its lessons into the ashes of a broken Europe, and what they rebuilt and remembered would change both nations forever. The trains rolled out of Texas in steady rhythm through 1946 and 1947. Long lines of olive-drab rail cars filled with men who had entered the war as conquerors and left as witnesses. Their journey back across the Atlantic was eerily quiet. No flags, no music, no uniforms of pride, only reflection. When they disembarked in Germany, most stepped into a landscape of ruin. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin lay in heaps of twisted metal and ash. Families scavenged for food. The proud Reich had become a graveyard of ideology. The returning POWs from America were stunned. They had lived behind fences. Yet they were the ones returning from civilization into chaos. Many found that their old beliefs no longer fit the world before them. They had seen a nation, their former enemy, governed by law, fairness, and compassion even toward captives. And now, standing amid the rubble of their homeland, those lessons became something more than memory. They became conviction. Historians later called it the Texas effect. It described how thousands of former German POWs who had been held in the United States, particularly in Texas, became quiet advocates for democracy, tolerance, and reconstruction in post-war Germany. Among them were future teachers, engineers, and civic leaders who carried home an unspoken testimony that dignity could exist even in defeat, and that freedom was stronger than fear. One of them, Friedrich W. Kruger, who had been a lieutenant at Camp Mexia, wrote years later, "We came home to ruins, but we brought with us an idea that a nation could be strong without cruelty. We learned that in Texas." The American government recognized this outcome as one of the quiet successes of the POW program. While the primary goal had been practical, labor, logistics, and adherence to international law, the secondary result was ideological. The U.S. had conducted, without fanfare, one of the most effective re-education campaigns of the entire war, not through propaganda but through example. In Texas itself, the traces of those years slowly faded, but never vanished. After the camps were dismantled, local farmers continued to speak of the German workers who had labored in their fields. Children who had once stared at the enemy through wire fences grew up with memories of laughter, music, and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the POW kitchens. Some of the former prisoners even returned, legally, this time. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, dozens of ex-POWs immigrated back to the United States, many settling in the same regions where they had once been confined. A few married American women they had met during work details or through church exchanges. Others sent letters or photographs maintaining friendships that crossed oceans and former battle lines. In Hearn, a few foundations of the old camp still remain, concrete steps leading nowhere, bits of rusted fence swallowed by grass. A small museum now stands there, built decades later, preserving the story for those who never knew that such a thing could have existed. A place where enemies found humanity in the midst of total war. Visitors walk among the exhibits. Faded photographs of German officers smiling beside American guards, orchestras performing in open-air barracks, and newspaper clippings reporting, "POWs help harvest Texas cotton." It seems almost impossible, yet it happened. In plain sight, in the middle of the most brutal war in history. The museum's curator once said, "This wasn't just a chapter of war, it was a test of character," and both sides passed. The story of the German POWs in Texas is not about victory or surrender. It is about what happens when the guns go silent, and men must face themselves, stripped of ideology, rank, and illusion. For the Germans, captivity became a mirror. For the Americans, it became a measure of conscience. Both emerged changed. By the late 1940s, the camps were gone. The fields returned to quiet, the fences to dust. But for tens of thousands of men, those years of captivity remained the most formative of their lives, a paradox of peace discovered within war. And for Texas, that strange experiment in humanity became part of its quiet legend, one written not in glory, but in decency. As one former guard reflected decades later, "We didn't win them with guns. We won them with how we treated them." That's the kind of victory you never lose. And thus, in a world torn apart by cruelty, a few fenced acres of Texas soil had proven a simple truth, that freedom, when offered instead of imposed, could outlast empires. In war, power often reveals its ugliest face: domination, destruction, and vengeance. But in Texas, behind barbed wire and under the unforgiving sun, power revealed something else: restraint. The story of the German officers who expected chains and were instead given shovels is not one of sentiment. It is one of strategy, morality, and the quiet endurance of principle. The Americans could have chosen retribution. The Germans, conditioned by years of propaganda, expected it. But instead, their captors chose something radical: to win through dignity. In those Texas fields, two worlds collided, one built on obedience and fear, the other on liberty and law. And in that collision, something extraordinary happened. Men who had once fought for tyranny learned what freedom truly looked like. When the war ended, many returned to the ruins of their homeland carrying more than memories. They carried a lesson that the moral strength of a nation is measured not by how it treats its friends, but by how it treats its enemies. That lesson became part of post-war Germany's conscience, woven quietly into the rebuilding of a democratic state. It became part of America's too, a reminder that even in victory, The truest measure of power lies in mercy. Today, when the winds move across those same Texas fields, they pass over open ground where fences once stood. Nothing remains of the watchtowers or the guard posts. Only the memory of a time when enemies worked side by side, bound not by chains but by circumstance, and yet, from that unlikely soil grew a truth that endures still, that humanity, even in war, is a weapon far greater than hate. Because in the end, the story of the German officers in Texas is not about captivity. It is about the triumph of conscience, the quiet, steadfast belief that even in mankind's darkest hour, decency can prevail, a victory not written in blood, but in the way one nation chose to hold its enemy, and in doing so helped redeem them both.